Hello, and welcome back to the Argyle Financial Controller Forum. My name is Brittany Sullivan with Argyle. A couple of notes before I turn things over to our speaker. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event and for the following week. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat, and we will address your questions at the end of the session. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Imran Gohar, Principal Solutions Consultant at Apsen. We are excited to have Imran with us for a thought leadership titled 5 Ways AP Process Bottlenecks Can Kill Your Bottom Line. Welcome, Imran, and over to you.
Hi, everyone. So first of all, thank you very much for joining this Apsen webinar. So my name is Imran Gohar. I'm a Senior Solution Consultant here at Apsen. So the topic we're going to be looking at today is what are the 5 ways AP process bottlenecks can actually kill your bottom line, meaning what are the challenges within accounts payable department that have a major impact on an organization's bottom line. So we're going to be looking at what those challenges are. We're also going to be touching on why current digitization and automation technologies have not been able to address those challenges. And then we're going to also talk about what is the future for technology within AP? So we're going to touch on artificial intelligence, how artificial intelligence-based systems are changing the way accounts payable work. And I'll show you a quick demo of the Apsen Autonomous AP solution and how it goes about resolving some of those bottlenecks. So hopefully you'll find today's session insightful. So let's start off. All right, so before we touch on the bottlenecks or the challenges, let's actually look at what comprises an AP process. So I'm just going to run through this workflow just so that I can outline what are the different stages an invoice has to flow through when it gets processed within the AP department. So typically, the invoicing process kicks off when a vendor invoice is received within AP, and that invoice could be coming in as an email PDF attachment, or it could be sent in by the vendor as a paper document. Now, if it's a paper document, obviously AP has to digitize that paper document to either a PDF or an image format. But then with email PDFs, also, they have to extract that invoice from that email itself. Now, invoices could also arrive into the AP department as directly from the vendor's accounts receivable system as XML files, or you could say EDI files. Now, once all of these invoices are received within AP, the first thing AP have to do is to extract the data from those invoices. And once they have extracted that data, then what AP is doing is they are verifying that that data is correct, and they will validate those data elements against not only their master data, which typically resides in an accounting system, but as well as they would be looking at external validation lists or external validation systems to basically validate that invoice information. Now, typically, companies would be looking at, okay, is the vendor details accurate? Is the vendor an approved vendor in our master data? They would also be looking at, okay, the bill to company, is that correctly defined? Is the currency correct? Is the, for example, the payment terms or the tax and VAT information accurate on that invoice? Now, once the data has been verified by AP, then depending on the type of document it is, AP will either trigger a coding and workflow process. So if it's a non-purchase order invoice, meaning an invoice that's not backed by a purchase order, then AP will then basically try to code that invoice. Or they would actually reach out to someone within the business to provide the right accounting codes that need to go onto those invoices. And once those invoices are coded, then they are sent into the approval workflow, because all non-purchase order invoices have to be approved before they can be paid. Now, if the invoice is a purchase order backed invoice, meaning that the invoice needs to be matched to an approved purchase order and or good receipt, then AP will be performing that match process. If the match is successful, meaning that the invoice matched successfully to a purchase order, as well as maybe a good receipt, then that invoice is going to go straight through and get paid. But if there is match exceptions, meaning that AP tried to match the invoice, but then it didn't match correctly, in those cases, any exceptions triggering, it's AP's responsibility to actually resolve those exceptions. Now, the last step in the process would be typically running audit checks on invoices. So this typically involves making sure the invoices are not duplicates. The vendor on the invoice is not on any blacklists or sanction lists. Plus, AP also has to ensure that all auditing data has been collected, meaning if invoices went through an approval process, then they have all the timestamps and the approvers' names, as well as if anything was changed on the invoice, then all of that information was properly logged. And it's only then that the invoice actually flows into the accounting system and a payment is made to the vendor. Now, if you look at the whole AP process in this particular workflow diagram, you'll find that each and every activity in this process is very manual today within AP. And this is even after introducing digitization, automation technologies. AP still have to touch every invoice, which then in turn creates a lot of bottlenecks and challenges for AP. So let's have a look at what are these different bottlenecks and challenges that actually plague AP departments even today, and what is the impact of these on the AP department and on the company as a whole. Right, so the first major bottleneck or challenge is the data extraction or capture process. Now, typically in most AP departments, they would have the traditional OCR tools to help them extract data from the digital documents that they are receiving from a vendor. Now, OCR tools are very good at extracting structured invoice data. And what I mean by that is typically header level data, which is presented on the invoice by the vendor in a structured format with the predefined or predetermined keywords, etc. And to be honest, with a lot of the traditional OCR tools, you can actually hit 65 to, you could say 75% data capture accuracy. Now, the problem starts happening when you also need to extract unstructured data from invoices. So that's where the OCR tools start struggling. Now, you have to remember with OCR tools that they need to be told where to find the information on an invoice document, as well as you need to have the right keywords provided by the vendor on the invoice for them to pick up or extract the right information. If information moves around, the OCR tool starts struggling. And that is the major challenge with unstructured data, because typically unstructured data on an invoice is the line level data. Now, every vendor that invoices today, they would have their own ways of presenting line level data. They would have their own keywords. They would have their own, you could say, format in which their lines are presented on the invoice. And that's where the OCR tool really starts struggling. To add to that, line level data or unstructured data is typically spread across multiple pages as well. And that's, again, a big challenge for the OCR tool, is to scour through all of those different pages and to be able to extract the information. So what's the impact of OCR not being able to extract all this information that AP need to process an invoice? The major impact for AP is that because if the OCR is either not able to extract data or it's not extracting that information correctly, then they have to intervene and actually touch each and every invoice. Because on each invoice, the OCR is struggling with one element or the other, and therefore AP has to step in to either make corrections or to manually extract that information themselves. And you can just imagine, if you're processing thousands and thousands of invoices, how difficult it would become for AP to actually monitor and actually touch every invoice to make sure that they get the right information out. And that's where the bottleneck appears. Because when AP is touching every invoice and the volumes are increasing, then either an organization has to increase their AP team size, or they have to actually introduce different, you could say, steps to ensure that the data that the OCR has extracted is accurate and it meets their requirements to process that invoice. So what that results in is longer processing times, high cost of processing an invoice, and that can then result in a major impact on a company's bottom line. Moving on to the next challenge that presents itself within the AP process is the data validation. Now, the data validation aspect within an AP process is contingent on the quality of data. So let's take an example. If the OCR tool is tasked with extracting the IBAN numbers for every vendor, because you need to validate that IBAN number against, let's say, an external IBAN validation system or list, then the system has to make sure that, or the OCR has to make sure that the complete IBAN character string is extracted, first of all. And secondly, if that information is moving around on the invoice, then again, you need to make sure that the OCR knows where to find that information. So this creates major headaches for AP, because if you look at a typical AP process, then AP is actually doing more than 20 plus validation checks on the data on an invoice, on every invoice, literally every day. And those checks could be happening at different stages of the invoice processing process, meaning some checks need to be done when the data is extracted, other checks might need to be done when the invoice is approved, and there might be other checks that need to be done before invoice goes into the ERP system. Now, if AP has to touch each and every invoice because the OCR or other technologies that extracting the data is either not able to find the data elements correctly, or they're not capturing them correctly, then that creates a major bottleneck for AP and the overall process as a whole. Because now AP is validating each and every invoice for all of these different checks. And in some cases, AP might not know that they need to run all 20 checks on a particular vendor's invoice. It might be that there are just 10 checks that they need to do on those invoices. And therefore, it just keeps on adding to the workload of AP, where they're having to touch every invoice to just make sure that every data element has been validated before it goes into the ERP system for payment. Again, the impact of this is that the processing times significantly go up. You need to hire more people, which basically means the cost of processing an invoice goes up. And then you could also, in some cases, AP is not able to do all these checks in one go. So that opens up, you see, the risk of processing an invoice with incorrect data. Again, it has a major impact on a company's bottom line. Thirdly, I think when it comes to AP environments where they are processing lots and lots of, let's say, non-purchase order invoices, meaning invoices that are not underpinned by a purchase order, then one of the major activities for those types of invoices is the coding of those invoices. Now, all of these coding information or the counting string that needs to be applied on that invoice either comes from AP, or AP has to go out into the business and find out someone who can actually provide them with the correct coding string. I would call this information as institutional knowledge, because AP would, if they are coding an invoice, then they would acquire that knowledge, and over time they will become very good at coding those invoices. And the major challenge here is that no system can actually mimic this ability within accounts payable, meaning that for a system to basically be able to code invoices correctly to the correct GL account code, to the correct cost center, for example, not only does it need to understand the information that it's looking at, but it also needs to understand the nuances, the different use cases that maybe are existent within an AP department. And therefore, typically the coding process of invoices has always been a manual exercise within accounts payable that no system has been able to automate. And that's because no system has the ability to actually derive coding or have the understanding and intelligence to predict coding for invoices based on the information the vendor has provided. Now, again, if you are a non-PO heavy environment, then it has a major impact, because again, invoices are being touched by AP. They are being coded. They also, being human, there is the challenge of human errors. So if you miscode an invoice, you might have problems downstream when you're trying to pay that invoice, and so on and so forth. But then on top of that, to add to a company's woes, all that institutional knowledge that AP acquire over the years with experience is all you could say it all resides in the AP person's head. So there's no way of actually transferring that information to someone else easily, or documenting it, or actually teaching a system. Because when those AP people, they leave the business, they take all that knowledge with them, and then that knowledge is lost. So the challenge there for organizations is that when they hire new people, they have to go through they go through the same process, or they have to be ramped up again on all of that knowledge, as well as and they have to understand all of the different use cases and nuances concerning different vendors and how their invoices are processed. So if you just imagine how much that slows down a normal AP process, then you will realize that it has a major impact on not only the processing times, but then it increases or further increases your cost of processing the invoice, because you will also have delays, which might result in late payment fees. Plus, if there are some early payment discounts that you were leveraging before, you will not be able to leverage those, because your AP team is not able to process invoices quick enough. So there's a major impact in this case on the company's bottom line. Now let's switch to the other type of invoice, which is purchase order invoice, or invoices which are backed by an approved purchase order. So in this particular scenario, what typically happens is that when a purchase order invoice comes in, then it has to be matched to an approved PO. And if there are good receipts that are being done against that PO, then you also need to make sure that the invoice matches to that. Now, the problem here is not with the actual matching process itself, but it's to do with the exceptions. Now, typically AP wastes a lot of time chasing people for either good receipts or for approvals or for changes to the PO, because the invoice has come in, it has failed match, and now someone on the procurement side or the end user side has to take an action for AP to resolve that exception and pay that invoice. And that's where the challenge comes, that there is no easy way to basically process these types of invoices with technology, with the current technology at least. And that is because for any system to be able to resolve exceptions on an invoice, they would need to understand what that exception is, and then what actions to take to address that exception. On top of that, if you have a very complex matching environment, meaning you're matching multiple invoices to a single purchase order, where you need to figure out which invoice line needs to match with which purchase order line, then that further adds or exacerbates the problem, because now AP is manually matching each invoice line items to the corresponding purchase order line item. And that really adds to the workload of accounts payable. Now here again, if you're a purchase order heavy environment, you will have major challenges with AP getting those invoices through quick enough, and then also to get to reduce the cost of processing those invoices. Even though with purchase order invoices, typically the invoice just needs to match successfully to the PO and the good receipt for it to go and get paid. So I think from that perspective, it should not be a difficult process. But because of these challenges in the process itself, it creates a lot of headaches, and therefore has an impact on an organization's bottom line. Right, so coming to the last area which I wanted to touch, or the last bottleneck, that basically focuses around audit and compliance. Now, I think we live in a very turbulent time. There's a lot of things happening around the world, on instability, both socially, economically, and conflicts around the world, which has resulted in a lot of additional workload being put onto AP. So for example, with all the wars going on, I think a lot of governments are mandating that different countries don't do business with different individuals and different, you could say, companies or businesses. And therefore, a lot of companies are having to basically run different compliance checks against sanction lists, against blacklists, against other lists, to make sure that they remain compliant with all of these requirements. On top of that, I think a lot of the tax authorities, they are mandating that a lot of these invoices coming in should be certified with their specific systems before they get paid. Now here again, AP has to ensure every invoice that comes in has been certified by the tax authorities within a particular jurisdiction before that invoice can go through. And then you have a lot of fraudulent activity happening as well. As economic conditions go down within organizations and companies and countries, you see an uptick in fraudulent activity. So again, AP is at the forefront of trying to prevent those, of trying to make sure that they don't end up paying a fraudulent invoice or a duplicate invoice, because it's very difficult to recoup that cost once it's left the company. So in that context, again, there is a major impact on AP in this context, and that will obviously have a material impact on a company's bottom line. So let's go into the AppSend Autonomous AP solution, and let me show you some of this stuff in real time so that you can get a feel of how the technology has evolved and what's out there that could actually help you address a lot of these bottlenecks that we see within the AP process. Okay, so I'm logged into the AppSend Autonomous AP solution. So AppSend is an AI-first technology platform that provides solutions for finance operations. One of our major solutions, this Autonomous AP solution, addresses a lot of the challenges that we see within AP, where it autonomously processes an invoice end-to-end and actually performs all of the different activities that AP have to perform on a particular invoice. So within the AP Workbench here, I can see all of the invoices that the AI or our solution is processing. And this is where I have full visibility of what the technology is doing. I can see which invoices were processed by the AI straight through, so the ones which are in green and say created. And the ones which are being flagged for AP review are the ones which are showing up as review data and review validations. So let's go into the first invoice here. So this invoice is what we call a CDW invoice that was received within the system. Now, as I mentioned, AI uses what we call computer-driven or Autonomous AP uses computer vision-driven AI models, which basically read the pixels and the data from these invoices. And these models are pre-trained, so they have seen millions and millions of invoices. So they understand how an invoice is structured, what information exists, and how those invoices are presented by vendors. So what the AI does is that it immediately, once it scans this invoice, it identifies the different features. So in this case, you can see it's identifying the logo, all of the different header level information and line information as well. And the beauty of AI is because it's reading the information like a human does, it can just identify the vendor based on just the logo itself. Now here at the top at the extractions, once it's identified those features on the invoice image, it will extract them. And it can extract quite a large amount of information. And that information could be at anywhere on that invoice document. So things like VAT registration IDs, banking information, there might be VAT information, there might be other account codes or project codes, etc., that companies might be extracting. So all of that information, the system will extract, including the unstructured data, which is your line level data in this case. Now, once all of this data is extracted by the AI, then it will do run validation checks. So basically, on this side, it will figure out, okay, based on the information I see on this invoice, what are the different checks I need to perform? Now, some checks would be common across all invoices, but then there might be other particular checks that the system runs purely for the type of invoice. So for example, you might want to do additional checks on invoices, which might be legal specific invoices or project related invoices, where you're checking the project codes and other things. So in this particular case, this particular invoice, as you can see, is a purchase order invoice. So the system has extracted the purchase order number. And then as long as the system has access to your procurement system or your accounting system where the POs are being created, it will actually pull that information from the PO and then have visibility of, okay, what is the PO, what are the different goods and services that were ordered, and then it will try to do a three-way or two-way match with this particular invoice. So here you can see that it's performing a two-way match with this particular invoice with this and this purchase order. And then if everything matches, then this invoice can go straight through for payment. But if there are exceptions, then the AI will actually trigger autonomously whatever action needs to happen. So if good receipt is missing, it'll figure out, okay, who's the person that's the PO owner or requester, and I need to send them a notification saying that you haven't good receipted the PO line items or the goods and services that you have ordered, and therefore a three-way match has failed. So you need to take this action on the procurement system side before I can go and process this invoice. So these types of activities, the AI is able to perform autonomously. Now let's take another example, which is the one which is in review data. So in this case, as you can see, we have got another invoice. Now, and this is an invoice, a freight specific invoice from UPS. And again, you can see the system has extracted the data. And what it's saying to me on this invoice is that I can see that this is a non-purchase order invoice, meaning that the system needs to code this invoice. So here at the bottom, you can see for this UPS invoice, the system would have looked at how historically UPS related invoices were coded. Plus, it will also look at the actual information on the invoice to figure out, okay, what should be the company, what should be the account or GL account code, the cost center code, maybe additional accounting strings that it needs to code on this invoice. Now, this activity would typically be done by AP because they would be coding all of this data before sending this invoice into the approval workflow. But in this case, the AI can do this coding. And then if it's doing it for the first time, or maybe it's not sure about certain pieces of information, it will flag this invoice for review. And once AP clicks save and continue, then what the AI does is it takes that feedback and it looks at the invoice and says, okay, AP didn't change anything. So that means I coded this correctly, and therefore I can now update my confidence levels at the back end for this particular vendor invoices, that I'm coding these to the correct GL account codes and other accounting strings. So the next time this invoice comes in, I don't need to flag this invoice for review, and this can go straight through because I can code it and I can process this invoice myself. So that's where the beauty of AI comes into play, where it's divorcing AP from the process once it's learned how to process the invoice correctly. Now, the last example I want to touch here is the one which is review validations. So this is an example where we've got this invoice from this vendor Datical. And what the system is saying is that this invoice has failed audit check. So the system ran a duplicate audit check on this invoice, and you can see that it's detected a duplicate invoice. So if I were to go into more details and look at this invoice, then the system shows me the two invoices side by side. So this is the actual historical invoice that was processed by the system previously, and this is the one that is having the exception. So as the AI is comparing not only the data as well as the images, so what it's saying to me is that, look, the invoice number seems to be different, but everything else is the same. So this could be a potential duplicate. And that's where the system can actually detect these small changes or small differences within invoices and flag those to AP, so that any invoice that might be a duplicate or a fraudulent invoice can be actually caught before it goes into the ERP system. Now, it might turn out that this might be a false positive, meaning that the invoice is not actually a duplicate, and the vendor invoices the organization this way. So again, at the top, you can see the system that allows you to give it feedback, meaning if I were to say this was a false positive and not a duplicate, I can say no. And the system then again learns from my feedback and says, okay, now I understand for Datical, these types of invoices are allowed, and therefore I will not flag this as a duplicate next time. But if I say yes, then the system says, again, learns from that feedback, and then it understands that for Datical, these types of invoices cannot come in, meaning where you have everything the same and there might be small elements which are different. So it will keep on flagging those and taking action, which could be either rejecting those invoices or taking other additional actions. So again, because the AI has the learning capability, it becomes better and better as it processes or sees more and more of these invoices. And that's the point, that you're basically transferring the institutional knowledge, which sits in an AP person's head, to the machines. You're giving it, you're telling it how to process invoices in certain use cases so that it learns, and therefore it gets better and better over time. And therefore it starts addressing all of those bottlenecks and issues that AP see within the AP department. And that's why I believe that AI-based technologies like AppSend's autonomous AP solution are the future for AP. Okay, with that, in summary, the future for AP are autonomous AI solutions. And I say that because any solution that is not automating the complete AP process will not be able to deliver the return on investment that an organization expects. Secondly, any solution that doesn't have the ability to learn, that doesn't have the ability to adapt to changing business environments or invoicing formats, will not be able to address a lot of the bottlenecks that we see within accounts payable. And that the system has to basically automate each and every activity that an invoice goes through, and it should have what we call intelligence, meaning the ability to predict and understand the information it sees on an invoice. So that's where you see the autonomous AI solutions are the ones that can actually do all of these activities, and therefore they are able to resolve and address a lot of these bottlenecks which impact an organization's bottom line in that context. And it's only by using these types of systems will you be able to increase your you could say processing times. You'll be able to reduce the cost of processing invoices. You'll have much better relationships with your vendors, and then you'll allow your AP team or AP function to become a strategic function rather than the transactional function it typically is today. And that's where the benefit and you could say the return on investment will sort of start bearing fruit. If you liked what you saw and you want to find out more information, or you want to sort of sign up for a free trial of the AppSend Autonomous AP solution, then please do reach out to us, and we'll be more than happy to help you with any questions. But with that, I come to the end of this webinar. I thank you very much for your time and hope to see you in the next webinar. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Imran, for such an insightful thought leadership. I also want to thank everyone for joining us today for this fantastic session. This session, along with all of today's content, will be made available on demand following the event.